So, Julie Levy is an independent scholar, writer, and activist. She is the managing director for the Save Ancient Studies Alliance, and they also run their own YouTube channel called Zylla's Athenaeum, and both heavily feature archaeogaming. She has two higher degrees in ancient Greek and Roman literature and language, and is particularly interested in comparative history, mythology, and linguistics. In their presentation titled By All the Wakened Waters, Language and World Building in Heaven's Vault, I now welcome Julie to the stage.
Hello, hello. Thank you for that introduction, Dan. Just do the obligatory, can everybody see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So, hi. As Dan was saying, I'm Julie Levy. I do a lot of historical linguistics work and a lot of archaeogaming, and Heaven's Vault is perhaps my single favorite video game to come out in recent times. A game where the main mechanic is epigraphy, the study of writing uh, in archaeological settings. So let's talk about Heaven's Vault. What actually is it? So Heaven's Vault is a 2019 release from Inkle Studios. The lead developer is John Ingold. There are a bunch of interviews that you can find with him where he'll talk about saying that the spark of this idea was just space archaeology, which quite frankly I relate to. My dream job that I have had listed on my internal little character sheet since I was a very wee baby was space archaeologist. I probably should call this space philologist nowadays since I don't actually do the picking up artifacts bit, mostly do the reading. So for those of you who are in archaeology, you might recognize that name Ingold. His father was Tim Ingold, who wrote Materials Against Materiality. John is not himself an archaeologist, but he was familiar with the subject matter when he came across the work of an Egyptian archaeologist, Dr. Monica Hanna, and he thought to himself, when we think about archaeologists, we think about Indiana Jones, we think about this, like rip-roaring adventure type thing that doesn't really have much to do with archaeology and with material culture, with finding out about the ancient world. And so instead of that kind of character, he came up with Aliyah Alasra, who you can see on the side of the slide here. She is just a normal person. She is effectively a graduate student at the University of Iox in the Nebula, which is our setting. The main mechanic, as I said, is epigraphy. So the main feature of this game is an ancient language that was created by John Ingold. It started with the idea of Egyptian hieroglyphics and eventually morphed into something that looks a little bit more like, where did my window go? Like this. So you have these glyphs. You can see I translated my title into ancient up there. So you have these glyphs that look not like an Egyptian hieroglyph exactly, but something fluid and unique. So um, the language did have to make some concessions to being mechanically playable by the average player. So for instance, when you're in the game, you are starting with Aaliyah's base knowledge. So you have some guesses as to how things go together. You're not starting with, well, what does this glyph mean? I have no idea. You're starting with, okay, well, Aaliyah knows a few things and I can choose what I think makes the best sense. Also, the grammar is a more accessible form than it might necessarily be in the real world. So things like that. I do want to talk a little bit about the setting. The setting of this game is the nebula. So it is constructed as a series of what they call moons, which are little world spaces. And uh, in between all of these places that they've settled, all of these moons, are actual rivers of water. And so they use airtight ships with sails to sail the nebula. Over the course of the game, the timeline expands. So the start of the game, you are basically the only historian that there is in the nebula because there has been a religious setting that discourages inquisition of the past, but inquisitiveness about the past. But over the course of the game, you start to find artifacts from several thousand years, and you start to get an idea of how the nebula came to be. I do want to say at this point that there will be some spoilers in here. I don't think that should stop you from playing the game, but just so you know, uh, there will be a couple of spoilers as to particular words and particular plot points, but this is a game that you can happily play over and over and over again and still get something interesting out of it. So, let's talk about how ancient is written. Individual glyphs of ancient hold a basic meaning. So you have these two wavy lines, and this is, I think, perhaps the single most similar to an Egyptian hieroglyph that we have. If you look at the Egyptian hieroglyph for water, it's pretty similar. It's two sort of jagged lines. So this means water, and water is super important to the game. Like I said, there are literal rivers connecting the nebula. Not to mention that water is necessary for life as we know it. And this is life as we know it. The only creatures here are humans, normal livestock like pigs, normal grains like rice. We don't see, there's nothing alien about this. So you start with water. And then you can combine glyphs to make more complicated words. So this little apostrophe is a possessive marker. It doesn't have a meaning other than possessive. And then the dot connects the two so that you know in writing that whatever was before and after it will be part of the same meaning unit. So apostrophe dot water, possessive connector water, means of water, waters. Um, and I think that probably was a very conscious choice to make the possessive glyph look a little bit like what we in English and a lot of other uh, Latin character using languages see as a possessive marker, the apostrophe. But then you get even more complex words using that with less obvious semantic relationship. So what I mean by semantic relationship here is, it's obvious to go from water to the possessive of water. It's a little bit less obvious to go from water to value, which is what we have in this next one. So that sort of upside down curly Q marks abstract nouns. And so it's a sort of abstracted idea of water. Water is important to life. Water is what connects the nebula. So what is the abstract concept of water? Well, it's value. And this is where we get into the world building. Just through the language and how it is written, you have to conceptualize the world in such a way that water is the most valuable thing in order to understand how they're writing their language, how they're putting it together. One other important thing I really want to note here is that there's no information about the phonology in the writing system. You cannot go from how it looks to how it sounds. There's no connection at all. This is not something that is particularly usual or particularly unusual. You, of course, get languages with alphabets like English, where you have one sign to mean one sound, and we have no information about the content of the word from the writing, all the way up to something like the Japanese use of kanji, the Japanese use of Chinese characters, where what the symbol means has no necessary relation to what it sounds like. You could have 4 possible readings for the same sign. I think it's a little unusual that there's no link here. It's much more common for something like that to have derived from a sound unit, uh, but we also don't have a full understanding of spoken ancient, so perhaps there is something to be gotten there if we knew more. When it comes to spoken ancient, we do get a little bit of it in the game, but only in a couple of places. It's actually pretty telling why it is in only those 2 places. So the 2 types of places that we find it are in the slang of the lower classes, in the poor neighborhoods. They'll use insults and random epithets. They'll call things by different names, and those things are effectively spoken ancient. Not that we know that at the beginning, but it will turn out to be true that this is spoken ancient. And then the other place that we find it is in some places that have ancient technology that speaks aloud. So I'm going to play you a couple of clips from my full live stream of this game with commentary. That's my partner Nathan on the other side of the screen from me. So I'm just going to play you a couple clips of a word being spoken in ancient in both of these contexts. Okay, Yazi is the man's name. Come on, creature buyer. Poor Yazi. Micus. Let's make one thing clear. You're free. As you say, Micus. Good luck, Farwet. Your name's Yazi? Let's just... means better. Oh boy, I'm not your better. Yuniha Mikis. And 6 has turned into an eagle. Welcome, overseer. So there we see the word Mikis being used in the current slang of the lower classes as a purchased slave to their purchasing master. They say it means better, but very clearly it's in the sense of ownership. And then in the ancient tech, it's used as overseer, which is not quite the same thing. There's still a hierarchical relationship, but clearly that meaning has evolved. Now, you'll notice that the actual word has not shifted, and we don't know for certain that there's no shift in language over the years, but that would be pretty unusual for a language to say exactly the same for thousands of years. But in order to make this game playable, I don't think they could have included the complexity of language shifts over time. So now I want to talk about how real language works and how it changes over time. So we are capable of understanding the patterns of how language shifts over time in the real world, wherever we have the records to do so. So I've taken an example here because I know it better than most other possible examples, but this does happen in all kinds of languages. We can take something like, say, English and Sanskrit, and we can trace them backwards through their predecessors all the way to Proto-Indo-European, a language which we have no written record of. The reason that we can figure that out is because we can trace all of the shifts leading up to it and figure out what the Proto-Indo-European must have been. Proto-Indo-European covers quite a lot. It's a very large language family. All the Germanic languages, all the Romance languages, uh, a good chunk of the Indic languages. Um, there were examples found in Western China and, of course, the Celtic languages, so huge spread. But in all of them, we can find traces of a large number of structures and words that we can figure out how they shifted over time back towards a common ancestor. So one of the really important words that we can trace very clearly is the word wheel. We can trace this backwards to the Proto-Indo-European root quequo, because we can see versions of it that conform to the sound shifts that we know about in a bunch of those languages. So we can see, kuklos in Greek. If you've heard of the cyclops, that is circle I, kuklos ops. We can see it in the Sanskrit, we can see it in the Latin, we can see it in the Germanic, we can see it even in English. It goes through a lot of sound shifts before it becomes wheel, but even wheel traces back to this root. Because we know that Proto-Indo-European had a common root for wheel, we can say, yes, they had the wheel. Whoever it was that spoke Proto-Indo-European, they had wheels. And we can't say that because there's no root, it didn't exist, but we can say that because there is one, it definitely had to. So when we can trace something that far back, when we can say that something is ancient, we can say that they had whatever that was. The meanings can also shift over time. I was talking just now about the word mikis in Heaven's Vault's Ancient. Uh, let's take another example from Proto-Indo-European. There's this root ten, which means to stretch. And it often retains that meaning when it goes into its daughter languages. We have Sanskrit tanoti, Greek tenein, but it also becomes string, something that is stretched out long and thin, such as Persian tar or Greek tonos. And then in English, from tonos, we get tone, a sound which is produced by a vibrating string. So the semantic shifts are not necessarily intuitive all the way along the way if you don't know the steps that got you there. When we come to ancient, this can get pretty interesting in telling us how the people who spoke it thought. So, of course, the most fundamental forms are the simplest. Water is just a single glyph. But it also gets really semantically complex. More than just value, we can also get something like the concept of pour. So we have a concrete noun marker, a negative marker, a life marker, connector, verb, water, and that means pour. That tells us how they're thinking about what it means to be poor. They have a life where they cannot produce value. That requires several cultural leaps in intuition, right? If we didn't know that water was valuable, this would make no sense. And yet, once we have that idea, putting water into the idea of poor actually kind of connects. So then let's return to Mikis. we talked a little bit about how it has those two sort of ends of meaning. It has better or owner, and it has overseer. But when we look at the word written in ancient, we can see that it comes from a very specific idea containing an idea of truth and decision. So our word for mikis is written person, robot, judge. The person who makes decisions for a robot. The person who commands robots, the overseer. If you replace robot with person, you can see how that becomes a slave owner. And so over time, we can see that the world has gone from expecting robot servants to expecting human servants, just in this one word. There are, of course, many more examples of this. So the history of the nebula, and not just the gameplay, is in the words that you learn along the way. The fact that ancient is no longer the primary spoken language, even though it still exists, versus the modern speech, tells you about the Ioxian imperial conquest and the class differences that that imposes. Remember, Aaliyah works for the university on Iox, and Iox is better, according to Yazi, than Elboreth, the planet that she's from. Sorry, the moon that she's from. The shift in the meaning of Mikis tells us about that shift from robot to human in the lower classes. And of course, I have to bring us back around to the title, the exclamations and swears that they use. In ancient, we hear Farwet and Salehwa thrown out. But what Aaliyah says in Ioxian is, by the goddess, bless the moons, by all the waken waters. And these things tell us about how she is conceiving. What does she swear by? What gods are in her background when she says by the goddess? What does she think of as the highest powers? The water, the moons. So every glyph tells us more about how the ancients thought, because they're telling us how they spoke. And here's just a little set of bibliography and some about me. There are some things that I'm sure will be shared in chat, but with that, I would like to invite any questions that you might have.
So thank you, Julie, for that excellent presentation. I'll be sharing those links in chat to find more about Julie here in just a moment.
You're still muted, Dave.
Thank you. I was not broadcasting. I am now doing so. So thank you, Julie, again for your presentation. I will be sharing those links in the chat here in just a moment. But at this time, I want to go ahead and welcome anyone to approach the QA line for any questions or comments you might have. If you don't feel comfortable doing so on video or audio, you can also do so in the chat, and I'll be happy to read them out on your behalf.
Sorry, I went too far. Hey, Julie.
Hi,
Yeah, first of all, it's almost 12 a.m. where I am now, but I was about to sleep, but because I really love Heaven's Vault, yeah, I want to first support you, and I really love Heaven's Vault, and I wish to ask you a question because, like the name of the university, what was it? The one
Ajax.
Ajax, yeah, Ajax, and when I played the game, for some reason, and the main character looked, Middle Eastern and stuff like this, I felt like it has some kind of a how do you say, um, like inspiration of what's happening. Like even Ajax, sounds something like Oxford or something like that, and the way they look at um, the moon where she comes from, as you know, it felt like that. So do you think there's some kind of a, you know, that it was inspired by actual archaeology, actual you know, scholars, actual events? You know, like sometimes I feel like the university, I'm not saying that's what's happening, but maybe there is some kind of a um, condescending way that could
Yes.
have affect the interpretation of the past, of ancient history. That I don't know. I felt it in the game. I always thought about it, but I felt it in the game. So do you think that also the same thing in the
Absolutely.
yeah.
That theme comes through very strongly in the game. You're right. Um, and I think it's pretty telling when it comes to the language, that the language of the ancients, the language that of the originators of the robots and everything that they take so
Mm,
seriously on IOX,
mm,
is something that they disdain, something that they ignore. I think that's very true to real life. Definitely, like I said, the creators were basing this on a lot of real life archaeologists, both in John Ingold's father's experience and in their sort of character inspiration in Dr. Monica Hanna, who is an Egyptian archaeologist of some note. Um, she's fabulous, by the way. Um,
mm,
and I think they really were going for showing the underside of how we treat the past, showing the
mm.
general disinterest with which it is treated by people who have an agenda, uh, especially an agenda for power. Um, and I think that there is, like, I've seen it in multiple interviews with the developer where he'll talk about the way that Aaliyah has to deal with antiquities trading and
Yeah,
that kind of
I
thing to
remember
get
that.
more information in order to find new artifacts, because it's just there's no legitimate resources to go about that. There's no above board way of dealing with these things, because people don't see money or power in it, and so it gets ignored. And I think this is very much at the heart of the game, is the real struggles that archaeologists face and that historians face in general when coming up against um, the power structures that already exist. And I do think that IOX
Mm,
probably does sound like Oxford for a reason. You know, the British Museum is kind of everybody's favorite
mm.
punching bag, might be too strong of a word, but you know, the Elgin marbles, the Parthenon marbles, we can't even say it without the colonizer's name half the time. And this
I agree.
is such an ongoing issue, right? It's not in any way unique. There's a huge movement among younger archaeologists, and more thoughtful archaeologists and museum curators who try and repatriate objects to work with the communities that they come from. But that doesn't mean that it's going smoothly or that it's an easy thing to do. I remember one particular case of a statue of Hercules. The top half of it had been cut off and sold to, I think, the Getty in California,
Oh,
and the bottom
wow.
half was in a museum in Italy where it had come from. And when they finally realized this, they had to work out an agreement between the museums to figure out what to do with the top and bottom half of the same statue. Um, so repatriation and ownership of antiquity is a huge class and race issue. And I don't think it's an accident that Ingold chose to represent the field with somebody with Middle Eastern seeming heritage. That El Bereth is very much coded as somewhere in the Swana area.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. That's an awesome answer.
Yes, thanks for your question.
I do want to just touch back on an earlier question that was raised in
You're
the
muted
chat.
again, Dan.
Thank you. I do want to raise a question that was mentioned in the chat. I'm not sure if you saw it before from EL. Does the same analysis resonate with a game like Chance of Sonar?
Yes, so as I mentioned, I do archaeogaming streaming of my own, and I just finished up Chance of Sonar a couple weeks ago on there. I loved that. That was so much fun. So in Chance of Sonar, I'm actually working on a post about this for Paizomen blog. In Chance of Sonar, we have the same sort of idea of glyphic language, but it's a very different kind of glyph. You don't really get concatenation the same way you do in Heaven's Vault, where you build more complex meaning by putting symbols together. In Chance of Sonar, you can sometimes dissect glyphs into other glyphs. Like especially towards the end, you actually get to play with that a little bit. But most of the time there you're seeing individual words either in isolation or in very simple sentences. So yes, but only a little bit. I did really enjoy that you could go so deep into the glyphs in Chance of Sonar, because I actually wasn't expecting it nearly as much because I knew they hadn't fleshed out the languages to the same extent. For those of you who haven't played, Chance of Sonar is a puzzle game where you do learn a bunch of glyphic languages, but they're much simpler. They have about 30 characters apiece, and it makes it clear that there's more that you're not seeing, more iterations that could exist that don't necessarily feed into your vocabulary, but it's definitely, it doesn't feel complete the way Ancient does. Thank you, EL. That was a great question.
And a thank you from me as well, because now I want to play that game.
Yes, you do. Yeah, I had so much fun with that. Oh yeah, as Kate's bringing up in the chat that Dr. Hannah was a guest on the SASA live stream of Heaven's Vault, and said that IOX reminded her of her own university in Egypt as far as both aesthetics and supervisors. Whew! Rough. That's rough.
Could we term that dangerously accurate representation?
Hey, at least it's pretty.
True.
No tea, no shade, her words. Thank you, Kate.
Well, I want to ask once more for anyone who has questions to please approach the mic or add them in chat. And as I let you deliberate, remind you again to please follow Julie on Blue Sky, Twitch, and Patreon. I have those links posted above there, and we'll repost them as well.
Yep. I also do have all of my old playthroughs on my YouTube channel, which is Zylla's Athenaeum. You can find all this stuff linked in my my poster in the exhibition room.
All right, well, seeing no other questions at this time, I want to thank you once more, Julie, for a terrific presentation there. And give us a little preview of our next programming for today. and there's going to be a presentation by Rosalind Campbell. This will be a presentation titled The Queen and the NPC, Player Perceptions of Gender in Assassin's Creed. And that'll be in about 22 minutes from now at 3 p.m. Central. So feel free to join us back here. But in the meantime, maybe look for that ARG trailhead Hadley told us about towards the lunch break. Check out the exhibition hall to find out all the places to follow Julie and the other presenters we have here today. Or even better, talk to your fellow conference goers. One of the beauties of this platform is to have those hallway-like conversations we're probably all familiar with in other conferences. But hey, here the drinks aren't nearly as badly priced, and I hope the food's a lot fresher for you too, wherever you are connecting in from today. And one other note here from Julie is before you go, please let us know if you'd rather see her play Heaven's Vault or something else tomorrow during their Let's Play. So please add those preferences into the chat. So for instance, if you want to see them play Heaven's Vault, or if you'd like to see perhaps another game that was mentioned today, please let us know.